Welcome to the Hey Mom podcast. This show is hosted by me, Audrey, and my sister, Rhoda. Every episode, we will be interviewing our mom. She is our permanent guest. If you have a dilemma, problem, or situation you want a new perspective on, please write in and we will share it on the show. As always, you will remain anonymous. Please email us at heymompodcast121@gmail.com or DM us on our Instagram. Our handle is heymom_podcast. That's all lowercase. Thank you so much and enjoy the show. Hey, Mom. So today is exciting because we have our first listener writing in with something that they're struggling with. And so I'm going to start this episode off today just jumping right into what they've written. So this person says, okay, my first boundary issue I'm having is someone who shows up chronically late every day to relieve me off of my shift. I don't feel comfortable leaving at the time I'm supposed to be, but I don't know how to enforce that my time is valuable. And it feels so disrespectful for this person not to care about my time and what I have going on. Usually, I technically can stay over the appointed time, but I don't want to. I have fulfilled my commitment and I need to move on with the rest of my day. I don't know that there will be bad repercussions if I did leave when I said I needed to be done. But I have another 2 months of this and I'm frustrated about it every time it happens. I want to bring this up in a respectful way and yet be firm that it is not an acceptable way to treat me.
So a couple of things stood out to me when you were reading that. And the first one was the word enforce. And the use of that word lets me know that you're trying to control the situation. Just even using a word like that means that you feel powerless and you're trying to figure out a way to regain your power. And our natural inclination when we feel powerless is to use a control mechanism. And so that's the first thing that I would just be aware of. So it's more like notice that. Notice the ways in which you're trying to control something as a response to feeling powerless in the situation. So set that aside.
Is that usually a marker of that they've been pushed way past the point of their boundary and now it feels like there needs to be extreme action to correct kind of like that extreme amount of disrespect this person feels?
It could be that, but I think it's also kind of human nature that when we get put in a situation and we don't like what's happening, we'll quickly turn to control because we don't know how to feel powerful in the situation.
Especially when it has to do with controlling another person's actions that you think is going to make your life better or the problem go away.
Right. Yep. So that's the first thing. And that's just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about a problem like this one. And I'm also speaking directly to the listener who sent this in. Like, keep that in mind in the way that you think about your problems and your situations. And if you catch yourself using controlled language like a word enforce, or I want to make them, or how can I get them, using the them, they, the other person, those are all indicators that you're in a controlled state of mind rather than an empowered state of mind. So now, having that set aside, the second thing that I also noticed was that it feels like you want to have a conversation with this person because you are angry, you are frustrated, you are hurt, you're sick of it, and all of that pent up frustration and even rage can make you feel like I want to confront this person. And boundaries don't necessarily mean confrontation. Sometimes they require confrontation, sometimes they do not, and that will be for you to decide based on the information we're going to go over. But just know that it isn't always a conversation. And going back to the principles of boundaries, the boundary is about you. So the boundary isn't about the coworker. It isn't about the coworker's behaviors. It isn't about whether that person's on time, whether they're late, whether they apologize. That has nothing to do with your boundaries whatsoever. That person did not cross your boundaries. I just want to make that very, very clear. You crossed your boundaries. You stepped out of your circle of safety and security to try to compensate for somebody else's poor decisions. That is the boundary that was crossed. It feels like the other person has crossed the boundary because they're not being responsible or doing what they need to do, and you're feeling like you have to make up for that. So you making the decision to stay after your allotted time is a choice you made. Nobody asked you to make it. Nobody's requiring it of you. You even said that you didn't think that there would be any kind of major repercussions. So there's not a lot of pressure for you to do this, other than you might feel a sense of personal responsibility, like, I don't want to leave this job until the other person shows up. There could be other reasons why you feel compelled to stay. But just know that it's your choice to do that. It is not the other person's choice. They didn't ask you to do it. They're not coercing you into doing it. And once you recognize that, you can go back to a place of power, which is me, the decisions that I made, the choices I'm making, the things that I'm going to do or I'm not going to do. And so in that situation, even though it's uncomfortable to own that, and it does not gratify the ego at all, because your ego's probably screaming right now. And like, why do I have to be the one that does everything right? This person needs to know how they're making me feel, etc., etc. That is just the ego that needs gratification. But the ego doesn't have good boundaries. If you want to have good boundaries, a certain amount of humility and personal responsibility is required in order to do it. And I'm just acknowledging that it's uncomfortable. I totally get it. I've had to set boundaries like this for myself, and I had to swallow my pride. It was just hard and uncomfortable. And I just want to acknowledge that it will be, and it might even make you feel a little bit angry for a minute, but there's no power in that. And so what we want to do is find where you feel empowered in the situation. And so just noting that for your benefit. The next thing I would say is, what do you want in this situation? And I think you answered that in the way that you phrased the question. You said, I want to go home. I want to get on with my day. I don't want to stay here. So it's pretty clear that you just want to do your time and leave. So what if you did just that? What if you just did your time and you left, and you didn't take on the burden of somebody else's behavior? Maybe you're doing it because it makes you feel like a good person. I couldn't know that unless you were sitting here and we were having this discussion. But the main thing that I can see is you have to do what you want, and if there aren't repercussions for doing it, then that is meeting your needs. And you're meeting your needs. You're making that choice. You're accepting the consequences. What you have to let go of is getting the personal gratification of confronting that person and letting them know how irresponsible they are, how they're being a bad employee, how they're mistreating you, because it really isn't true. And again, that might be really hard to hear, and I acknowledge that that might be hard to hear, But that would be based on the information that I have. That would be the way that I would respond to that. Do you have any thoughts, Rhoda?
Um, I mean, people misusing your time is always, I think, for most people, like most people value their time and feel extremely disrespected when you feel like someone is just kind of like, oh, whatever. Like they're obviously valuing their time because they're not on time. So they're obviously doing something they want. And it feels like a kind of a slap in the face to be like, oh, yeah, no, I'm just going to like mess around with my time and also abuse your time. That's how it feels.
Mm.
But I do think that like you're dead on, especially when it comes to boundaries, is that you want, I mean, especially my personality wants like I'm a little bit of a vengeful spirit. And so the idea of kind of like the smackdown, oh man, like I just want to tell them what's up, I get really sucked into that idea of wanting to get the gratification from the self-righteous encounter and be like, this is a boundary, and it's just like, not really.
Okay, so maybe we'll go down the path of maybe this listener actually wants to have that confrontation.
Because I would be, well, I mean, it's always easier said than done to have the confrontation. But my personality is a little bit more of like, I feel like I need to have the conversation typically, Although I like to explore the avenue of what would it look like not to have a confrontation, because I'm like, that's the only way. So it might actually be interesting to talk about the non-confrontational way to set a boundary in this situation, because I think that's the obvious route that people take. Is I have to sit down and have a conversation. It's like, maybe you don't. So I think we should talk about that.
Right. So we've explored what it would look like to have a non-confrontational boundary, which is you taking care of yourself and you acknowledging that it was your decision to stay and fill in the gaps for this late person. And that's not always the case. Sometimes you're in a position where you can't leave until the other person shows up, and that does create a different scenario.
So the non-confrontational way like would be to leave in the time that you said you were going to leave.
Yes.
But that also doesn't mean that your non-confrontational boundary doesn't turn into confrontation down the road, because that person might be like, what the heck? I got chewed out by the boss because there was this gap of time where no one had this shift.
Exactly.
You're supposed to cover me. You're supposed to, and that person might confront you. And so I guess that's what I think would be kind of interesting, is it doesn't mean there's going to be no confrontation.
Right. And that's a really good point, that you being more passive, which is the first example that we talked about, and just taking care of yourself might actually create a conflict and a confrontation that you're unprepared for. And so I would say now we'll explore what would a confrontational approach look like, because maybe this listener is thinking, that wouldn't work for me. I will resent this person. Even if I go home, I'm just secretly judging them the whole time.
Stewing in it.
Yeah. Or some people, like you were saying, for you, you just feel better when you're able to communicate and talk about what's going on, even if the person doesn't change their behavior. Like, it's something about what you need, which is why it's important to know, what do you want and what do you need? Those are the first two major important questions that I always ask when we're talking about boundaries. So maybe you do need to talk to that person, but make sure that you need to talk to that person for you and not to try to change their behavior or get them to change their behavior in any way. Because if you have a motive where you're wanting to change another person's behavior by having a conversation, you are crossing your boundaries and entering into somebody else's space, trying to control them. And that is never, ever going to work effectively. It may have some short-term success, but it'll have long-term consequences that you don't want.
But it's kind of sneaky that way, because it gives you the feeling of having set a boundary, but in the long term, it's something that'll actually probably come around and bite you in the butt.
For sure. The reason it's disempowering is in order for you to have what you want, the other person has to comply. And that gives power to the other person. Now, maybe you can shame them. Maybe you can terrorize them. Maybe you can threaten them. There's lots of ways to do that, but the power is still in their hands. They have to comply for you to get what you want. That's why it's not a boundary. A boundary is your ability to keep yourself safe and secure. That's it. That's all it is.
Right, with the whole boat rocking.
Yes.
Yeah, like keep yourself steady regardless of what the boat's doing.
Yep. So how can I keep myself safe and secure? And I mean that emotionally, physically, whatever that takes, that's a boundary. And when you give the power of, I don't feel safe and secure around this person because they're late all the time. So I need to have a conversation where I convince them, prove to them, shame them, or threaten them into changing their behavior. I'm still waiting for them to comply and watching and hoping and wondering if they're going to do it. And so I'm feeling more vulnerable and more insecure around what's going to happen. But the ego likes this a lot because then it gets to be justified, it gets to be right, it gets to be the good one, and the other person is the bad one. All of those things are what that part of our nature it thrives on.
Mm-hmm. So what would be kind of, you go and backtrack a little bit, like what would be the way to have an empowering confrontation that maintains boundaries?
Yeah,
in
okay.
that scenario.
So then I would say if you need to have a conversation with that person, number one, super important, you cannot be angry. If you're feeling anger, you are not in the right space to have that conversation, and it will not work. It will backfire. There will be problems. That person might be super apologetic. They might feel really bad because they don't want to see you angry. You might walk away feeling like, oh yeah, I'm right. You know, I really told them what for. But the next time they're late, you are going to feel so much more helpless, so much more rage and anger, because now they know explicitly how you felt and how bad it bothered you, and they did it again. You have given them double the power. So you cannot be angry. And if you cannot have a conversation with them because you're already so angry, then you better figure out how to cool down and get clear in yourself and take responsibility for, I'm not actually angry at them because they didn't hold a gun to my head and make me stay. I did that. I'm angry at me. I'm angry that I crossed my boundaries and did something I didn't want to do, and I'm actually blaming this other person for my choices. Now you recognize the anger is directed at the person that you're really upset at, which is yourself. Once you recognize that, then you can begin the process of reconciling your own relationship with yourself. Why do I do that to myself? Why am I willing to suffer for a lazy coworker that isn't showing up and is always late? Why do I feel like I need to do that? And then you can bring some compassion and some understanding. Maybe you have a pattern of doing that stems all the way back to childhood. Totally normal and relatable. And you can hold some space for yourself around that. It's like, okay, I get it. I get why I was doing that. I can appreciate it. It doesn't work. It's not getting what I need, but I know why I was doing it. And now I'm in a position to say, I don't want to do that anymore. And I don't need to be angry at this person because that person didn't make the choice. I did. And I don't need to be angry at me because I have a deep understanding of why I was doing it. So now I'm in a position to not do that behavior anymore. So once you're not angry, now you can assess, do I need to have a conversation with that person still? Maybe you do. Maybe you're the type of person that everything has to be out on the table. You just have to say how you feel. You just don't feel at peace in your body and with yourself until things are made known. Okay, I get that. So let's have the conversation then. So now you're not angry. You understand that you're the person who made the decision, not them. What is it exactly you'd like to communicate? And what do you hope to accomplish from that communication? That would be the question that I would ask. And if the answer is to get that person to not be late anymore, to get them to understand how much it affects me, all of those things are not your business. You can suggest it, you can offer the information, but you cannot guarantee that the other person is going to understand, care, be interested in your needs. All of that is outside of your boundaries completely. So if your objective is on those things, again, you're setting yourself up for breaking your own boundaries to try to get what you want from another person where their compliance is necessary for you to have what you want. So you get clear on that. And then you say, okay, do I still need to have that conversation? If the answer is still yes, you realize I need to have it for me. I need to hear myself saying out loud to another person, particularly the person who is doing this, I feel really taken advantage of when you don't show up on time. Now, if it was me and I was confronting that person, I would say to them, I understand that you may or may not change your behavior because of this conversation. And I am not asking you to be any different than you are. I realize you probably have reasons for doing the things that you do, and I am not privy to all of the aspects of your life to understand why you're late all the time. But I want you to know, because I respect you as a coworker, how your behavior is affecting me. And that is for me so that I can take care of myself better. And I'm just honoring what I need to say out loud to you. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you taking the time to hear me out. The objective there is to validate and support and acknowledge your needs out loud to the person who has caused you this offense or hurt you in this way. And once you say those things, objective fulfilled. You did it. Success. Check. Done.
So what's I think most of us kind of check in for like a feeling, like after an interaction like that, just kind of like, oh man, I'm actually still feel really bothered, or I still feel kind of angry. Or when you successfully put forward a boundary, communicate a boundary to another person, what's kind of the feeling that you think people can kind of check in with and be like, hell yeah?
For me, it always has two parts. The first part is a little bit uncomfortable, and the second part feels absolutely amazing. The first part is uncomfortable because you're having to let go of entitlement, self-righteousness, judgment, control of other people. You have to own your stuff. That's hard, and that's super uncomfortable. But it doesn't last very long because it's actually empowering. So that momentary discomfort almost always to me is a sign that I'm on the right track.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if the discomfort is not anger. If it's anger, that's a boundary breach. If I'm feeling resentment, anger, irritation, then I know, okay, I'm breaking my own boundaries again, and I'll reassess the situation. The discomfort I'm talking about is kind of that I don't know, exposure to yourself. That,
like, ooh.
yeah, exactly. The realization that you are playing a bigger role in this, maybe you feel a little bit uncomfortable with that.
There's some of your mess that needs to be cleaned up here.
Yeah, and that's hard. It's always hard. It never gets easier. But I'm I'm better practiced at it. And when I feel those feelings, I'm like, oh, I know what this is. This is the discomfort that comes from giving up control, sacrificing control in order to have power. And then comes the empowerment. And the feeling of empowerment is a sense of safety, security, self confidence, self respect, truly free of the situation, not having resentment for the other person. I often have a whole new view of the person that I was judging. I find that they will respond to me quite differently. They'll often open up when they see that I'm not actually angry, and they're often inspired to take responsibility for themselves if they see me owning my part. And sometimes their behavior changes, but I would say most of the time it doesn't. Because again, people have really good reasons for why they behave the way they do. They might not be the best reasons, and they might even be immoral and wrong, but they're still good reasons for them. They still make sense to them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely feel like there is almost like a sense of elation when you successfully empower yourself. And it feels incredible. And like, even for myself, it doesn't happen often because laying a solid boundary, either through confrontation of that person or just doing it behind the scenes personally, like nothing feels better.
Do you happen to have an example of something that comes to your mind when you've had that experience of elation?
Um, I do. The only problem is like, I don't remember the exact situation. I just remember that it was coworker related.
Mm.
And I was driving around with you, and like, I remember telling you about the situation, and you were just like, you did it. Like, as I was like explaining to you kind of like this new route that I took with this person that I was struggling with. And you were like, no notes. I was like, hell yeah. Like, and just the feeling in the moment, I actually think there was probably a little bit more of that discomfort. But talking it through with you, I was just kind of like, oh my gosh. Like the success and the empowerment, you realize you backed yourself up. You had your own back. And like that was so satisfying for me to recognize that I did something really difficult and that I changed enough of my old patterns and behaviors that I was starting to do it without having to think super hard about it or to feel like I need to do X, Y, and Z. Like it was an interaction where I felt like I actually did it without a lot of like, I don't know, brain power. And
Well, you said something really important there. You had your own back. And what I think that implies is that you took responsibility first, that you didn't have your own back.
yeah,
So
a lot of those interactions, I was caving to a lot of things that like I was not okay with, or I was just like, it's not that big of a deal until all of a sudden it was a huge deal.
yeah, and so that discomfort part of the experience was the realization that you didn't have your back. The coworker was doing what the coworker was going to do regardless, but you were betraying yourself in some way. And when you accepted and acknowledged that and took that accountability, only then were you able to have the power to have your own back. So I think that idea of it will feel uncomfortable and then you experience the power of it is pretty consistent with the experience of setting a good boundary.
Yes. Well, and even there's a satisfaction, even because in my situation, that person didn't change. Like that behavior didn't change, but I had the confidence now that regardless of the path they chose to take with their actions, that I knew how to take care of myself. And so honestly, there was a satisfaction in knowing that, or even hoping that they don't change, because that's going to give you an excellent kind of space to recognize whether or not your boundary for yourself has been corrected and established. Because if all of a sudden they change due to your behavior, it's like there's a little bit in the back of your mind of like, is it better because they changed?
Right.
And so them not changing in my situation, I was just kind of like, I love that you didn't change, which was also wild because I really wanted that person to change.
Or at least you thought you did until you realized that you wanted you to change.
Yes.
And as uncomfortable as that was to own the part that you were playing, it also gave you the power to behave in the way that was going to take care of you and provide you with that sense of security, safety, and confidence going forward.
Yeah.
Okay, one more thing that I wanted to add. And, if you think about the situation, this chronically late coworker, and you are always filling in for them, always covering for them in a way, you're possibly enabling that bad behavior by your actions. And one of the things that you can do that I think is actually a gift to the other person is when you have your own boundaries, when you are staying within your own boundaries and you go home, when you need to go home, you're actually allowing that other person to feel the real world consequences of their actions. You're giving them the gift of personal accountability by letting them feel the weight and the burden of their own behavior. And in a way, you're taking that suffering on when you stay and cover for them. And this way, you're giving it back to them. You're making their behavior rest on their shoulders. They have to suffer the consequences of being late, and you're stepping completely out of it. And I think that that is a really positive way to look at the whole situation. It isn't just about, me taking on my responsibility for how I contributed to this problem. You're also recognizing that there's another person who's behaving badly. And if I have good boundaries, in a way, it's going to give them the opportunity to take more personal responsibility for their behavior without you having to put it into their face or shame them or make them feel bad in any way. You just taking responsibility for you invites the other person to be accountable for their behavior as well. And they get to experience the consequences because you aren't covering and carrying the burden of their consequences for them. And so hopefully that's a bit more motivating.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hope that this person feels like we have answered their question. I mean, mostly you. In a way that they can apply to their situation or feel like they have a little bit more empowerment to address the situation.
And I'm sure there's a lot of people who deal with late coworkers.
Okay, so we have another story from another listener. And this issue, I think, is going to be very relatable for a lot of people. So I'll just jump right into it. So this issue I'm having is with my kids. I somehow allowed them to walk all over me and not be firm in what I expect from them. They don't listen, and I find myself yelling and raging mad before anything gets done that I've asked. I don't like this. I've tried rewards and removing rewards, no friends or having friends, and it still is like pulling teeth to get them to help me out without a fight. Yes, they are still little, but I have about 4 very simple jobs that they're required to do every day, and I find myself at level 100 rage every single day. It's unfair to them, and it's unfair to me. I don't know how to encourage and motivate them when they legitimately do not listen to a thing that I say, even especially when I am calm. I understand that yelling is not beneficial because they continue to ignore until the yelling hits a bigger and bigger peak, but I really feel so at a loss on how I need to handle this. I know I need to set and keep good boundaries, but I am honestly unsure of where to start.
Yes, I can imagine this being a very common issue for lots of parents. This is actually two problems. So the first problem is a lack of boundaries, for sure. The second problem has to do with how to motivate your children. So I just want to separate those because they're two completely separate and distinct issues. The thing that I was thinking about when you were reading that was, and obviously I don't have this listener in front of me to ask them this question, but what I would ask them is, does the yelling work? So when you get to that certain pitch where it's super loud or you're so upset that the kids suddenly jump into action and then they behave. So I'm curious about that. I don't know if the yelling just exhausts you and then, you end up doing the work yourself, or if the yelling reaches a certain point and then you get results. So that's something to consider. And I'll consider that in, my response as we go over this, that, there may be a different response if the yelling actually works. And by works, I mean the kids are terrified and they quickly go do what you ask them to do because they're scared. They don't like you to yell that loud, or they think something bad might be forthcoming. Or they know now that you're super serious. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go over this scenario. So the first thing that I would say, let's look at the boundary piece. I would ask you, what do you want? What do you want in this situation? Some possible answers you may have would be, I want my kids to learn how to do chores. Okay, that's very, very different from the answer, I want help with the chores.
Well, and I would even say, if I was in this person's situation, the most important thing to me would be, I want my kids to respect me enough to listen to me without having to yell.
Right. So it could be that it has nothing to do with chores whatsoever. And what you want is my kids to listen to me and be respectful and not only listen when I'm yelling at top volume. So those are three different desires that this listener could have. And each one would require a different type of boundary. I don't know if that's quite what I mean. But you need to consider, what do you want to get out of this? What is your objective? And then once you have that clear and you're sure, oh, this is what I want. I want my kids to listen and respect me. Let's just say, okay, yeah, it'd be nice if they did their chores. I also want them to learn to help around the house, and I also want the chores done regardless of who helps me. Maybe it's all three. And maybe that's part of the reason why there's such a level of frustration and overwhelm, is because you're trying to meet many needs all at the same time, and none of them are being met. And you don't know how to get what you want out of the situation. So the level of powerlessness is actually really, really high. And when you're dealing with young children, as a parent, you can feel incredibly powerless because you want to raise children up to feel loved and to be happy. And it's really hard to get them to do the things that they need to do. They might not be reasonable. You might not be able to have a conversation with them because they're too young, or they don't have the cognitive development. And so this is a really challenging situation. So I just want to acknowledge that this is really tough, and you got to get absolutely crystal clear on what you want out of the situation. So the second thing, once you ask yourself that question, like, what do I want and what do I need here so that I can get what I want? So those are always the first two important questions to ask yourself. Once you have that, then you can start to look at, the different ways to get that. Do I need my kids to do these 4 small chores? What if they didn't? Now, I'm not suggesting this as a parental technique or anything. I'm just exploring the possibility of, what if I didn't ask them to do the chores? What if I just did them? Now, this is good because it's going to produce a reaction in you, listener, when I say these things. And that's why I say them. I want you to notice the reaction you have when I say, why don't you just do the chores? Maybe you're feeling a lot of anger. You're like, I literally do everything. I just want a tiny bit of help. I've got these little kids. It's exhausting. They're old enough that they can help. Why aren't they helping? You want to pay attention to that because that's going to help you understand what it is that you actually need and what it is you actually want in the situation. And maybe you're looking at these kids and thinking, what are they going to act like when they're 15? Am I just going to be cleaning up after these kids for the rest of my life? So getting clear about it is really important. So I'm going to assume that you want all 3 of these results. You want your children to help you. You want them to learn how to do chores. And you also want them to respect you and listen to you without you having to yell. Okay, first thing, you have to stop yelling. You cannot use a method that, even if it works temporarily, you have to stop using that method because you will default to that every single time if you don't replace it with something better. So I'm not just saying stop yelling, bite your tongue off. And
Right. Let your kids walk all over you. Just don't yell anymore.
Right. Not suggesting that at all. What I am suggesting is you have to find something that works better than yelling. Better. If you don't, you will default to yelling because it probably gets temporary results.
And even releases some of the anger and tension you're feeling just in your body.
Right. And it may even feel gratifying to see your kids suddenly jump to attention. You're like, finally, I guess I do have a little power, but you don't. You have control using coercion and fear. That's all you have. You don't actually have power.
And it doesn't feel good. Like after that initial gratification of like, yes, Mom, whatever you want, Mom, please just don't yell at me anymore. Like that feels good for a second. And then you feel like a shitty parent.
Right. And that's for the long term.
Yeah.
And then you have to live with those feelings of guilt, like, I shouldn't have yelled at him. I don't like being that kind of a parent. But at least the bathroom got cleaned. At least the dishwasher was unloaded. And that's unacceptable. So the boundary is, I'm not going to yell. You create a limit for yourself to say, that's a non-negotiable. I will not yell at them anymore. And what this will do, and you can do this theoretically before you try it out in practice, you will start to get creative about, okay, what can I do instead of yelling? And I'm not suggesting that we try to get the kids to do chores because then we're thinking about controlling the children's behavior. What is happening inside of you that makes you feel like yelling is what you need to do? Do you need to blow off a little bit of steam? Why are you feeling this much anger this fast so early on in the day? Is there some underlying issues that are brewing all the time that aren't being taken care of? Maybe you don't know how, who knows what, but you're able to identify like what is going on internally and why is yelling my default method for managing this? And once you say, okay, I'm not going to yell anymore, well, then what am I going to do?
Yeah, because I think kind of like cutting yourself off from doing a behavior that you don't even particularly like about yourself can initially make you feel very powerless.
Yeah. So then you have to have another option to replace it. You can't just not do that behavior. So you have to think about what would be a replacement behavior. So an example would be, I'm not going to yell, I'm going to go do those chores myself. Again, not suggesting that this is good parenting or bad parenting, just wanting to explore what would that feel like. If you decided it's not my kid's job to do what I say to them. That's ideal. We want our children to respond and respect. But if I expect them to do that, that expectation is actually where the boundary breach happens. That's where I crossed my boundary and left the safety and security of my circle and entered into their territory to try to control their behavior.
Yeah, and I think because especially in spousal relationships and relationships with your kids, those are, I think, the default relationships where you're like, how do we function without expectations? Because I think most parents are, I'm responsible for this freaking kid. Like, how do I not put expectation on them when you feel that you're the responsible party for making them a decent person, for giving them good work ethic, for just putting them out into the world and hoping that they make it a better place.
Right. And I agree with that. And that's why I said these are two separate issues. So
Right.
you have to set the issue of, how do I get my kids to do their chores? How do I get my kids to respect me, etc. That has to be set aside, because it is a completely separate issue from, how do I manage my feelings, my internal feelings about this behavior? That's the boundary part of this conflict and this problem.
So there's one part that does have to do with your kids, and there's one part that has nothing to do with your kids.
Right.
Okay.
And you can't address the part of, how do I motivate my kids, until you have good boundaries for yourself. And those boundaries are being breached at the expectation level.
Right. Which I do think is just natural for parents to be like, I need to make clear my expectations so my kid can
Meet them.
perform and do their thing and we can all be happy. I think that's absolutely a normal concept for parents to apply within their parenting. And mostly just don't want this person to feel alone, that they're the only one putting expectations on their children. I think it's very common.
No, I myself did this a lot.
Yeah.
It's natural to have an expectation. And there's nothing wrong with the expectation. It's just that it's not working.
Yeah.
And if it's not working,
It's where the breach starts.
yes.
Is the moment you say, I expect my kid to do XYZ, boundary breached. The kid hasn't even had a reaction to your expectation yet. The boundary has been breached.
That's right. Because you have now placed the power outside of yourself and in the hands of the child. Now, the only way you can feel powerful is if the child complies. That's it. You do not feel power anymore, because you have now given that power to a child.
Which sounds ridiculous when you put it in that way.
Right. So you recover that by saying, I'm not going to have expectations of my children. And if I didn't have expectations of them, of course, that doesn't mean you can't want them to do chores, and you can anticipate their help and their support around the house. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an expectation. An expectation is a form of entitlement. An expectation says, you owe me this. You should be doing this. I deserve you to do these chores for me. That's the problem, is that entitlement. And it is putting that expectation on the child is a setup for that child to disappoint you and fail you. So imagine taking the expectation away. Just let the scenario play out without the expectation. It might sound something like, I don't necessarily need my children to do their chores. Just play with what that feels like. I don't want my kids to do their chores. See what happens in your emotional being. Maybe you feel, oh, now I have to do everything. And then we're back to the core of the problem. I'm overwhelmed. I'm overworked. I don't know how to cope with all of this mess and the responsibilities. And I'm taking it out on my kids.
Yeah. And even a more subtle thing that people in these situations might be feeling is loneliness
Right.
in just their daily life, and to feel like someone wants to pick up and help and wants to contribute and wants to, without you even lifting a finger, that can alleviate loneliness.
Right. And so it helps you identify the deeper issues that are happening. What if I didn't expect my kids to help me and they actually did? What if I didn't expect my son or daughter to come and unload the dishwasher or make their bed? And what if they did it? How does my relationship with that child feel differently when they perform? So then you go back to the expectation. Okay, I'm going to expect my child to unload the dishwasher. The child does it. How do you feel? You imagine those two scenarios. In the one where you have expectations, there's still a feeling of entitlement. It might sound like, well, it's about time. Or, well, you didn't unload the silverware right. Or there's still this sense of judgment. There's a not good enough. You didn't do it quite right. Or it's about time you did it. What took you so long? There's no gratitude. There's no connection. There's no respect on,
Appreciation.
yes, on the part of the child. And so then you wonder why the child doesn't want to perform for you. So then you take the other side and you really truly get to a place where you have no expectations on that child. You're like, that child is a free agent, a free human being who has choices. And I want that child to choose from their place of free will to do these chores because they want to help, and they want to help their mother. They want to support and make the home a lovely place to be. You want it to come from them. You don't want it to come from control and fear and intimidation and guilt.
Coercion.
And if you can imagine that child doing that from a place of free will, wouldn't that be preferable? Wouldn't that be ideal? Well, the child cannot do that if you are imposing an expectation. They cannot. They can meet your requirements, but it will not come from their free will. It will come from fear, or it will come from resentment, or it will come from shame. It won't be coming from them. And they'll be crossing their boundaries to try to get you to stop yelling at them. So then you're teaching them how to have poor boundaries and how to manipulate each other to get their needs met because they're learning how to do it from you. So it's a double whammy. When you have good boundaries and you don't have expectations of them, you're actually teaching them how to empower themselves and operate from a place of choice. So on the flip side, there's also a double reward when you're able to successfully do this, because then your kids will grow up with healthy boundaries and be able to navigate their life with less frustration than you're currently experiencing. So you slowly begin to let go of the expectations. Like, I'm not going to expect this of them. I'm going to try to teach them why it's important and why it's valuable and why they would want to choose it.
Yeah, because I think influence is where a parent shines.
Right. That's power.
Yeah. Because influence is giving them information based on your experience and what you value, but without the expectation of there needs to be X, Y, Z met for you to get my love, my appreciation, my respect. It's saying, here's what I've learned. Here's the information I've accumulated over my time. Do with it what you will. That doesn't mean you can't even shift it in a way that is preferable to you, but recognizing that they have free will and that them making the decision is way more powerful than them conceding to your desires.
Right. And then if you think about it, if you're yelling at the child in an attempt to get the child to respect you, you're disrespecting your child to try to get the child to respect you.
It really doesn't make sense when you look at it from that perspective.
Right. So then maybe instead of yelling, in this example, you could say, okay, I'm not going to yell anymore. And instead of yelling, I'm going to find a way to respect my child's free will and inspire and influence them to want to do the things that need to be done, not because I'm overwhelmed and desperate, or because I just need the chores done, or any other reason, but because I want that child to have self-confidence, to learn the value of respect, learn to listen, because you're not listening to that child when you're yelling. And being calm is not necessarily the answer either. I'm not saying that just be calm.
Right, because there can be a disingenuousness with just, okay, I'm going to try and gentle parent real quick when like you're infuriated.
Right.
You know, your kid's picking up on like, oh, she's even weaker now.
Right. Well, and you're not teaching them respect because you're not respecting them. They have to learn respect from you. So let's just say you wake up in the morning and you're looking for a moment in the day when you're not angry and raging at your kids. Maybe they're doing something cute, you're watching them play together, you're smiling. You want to lock in on that feeling. And you want to hold that and say, this is what I want to carry with me, this feeling. I don't want to compromise this loving, happy experience that I'm having with my children. That's the boundary I'm going to keep. So I'm not going to have expectations of them. So I'm going to replace the expectation with some form of communication, or how can I inspire them to behave in a way that is going to be beneficial to everybody, to the whole. So you're meeting their needs, you're meeting your needs. Again, this would be much easier if I was having this live conversation with a person who could present me with...
Who could answer all of the questions.
Right.
Because we can only get so much information when this person is writing in with the bare minimum. You don't get to know what their desires and what their reasons are for why they're doing what they're doing.
Right. But the principle is the same, and understanding where you're breaking your own boundary, that's key. So if you're knowing it's the expectations, that's where the problem is happening. I only get angry because I have an expectation that's not being met. I'm not angry because the chores aren't getting done, because that actually isn't true. Imagine if your kids were at the babysitter's and the chores weren't getting done. You're probably not going to feel angry because there's a justifiable reason that those chores aren't getting done. It's your expectations that aren't being met that are making you angry. Not the chores not getting done, not the child not listening. It's the expectation that the child should do these specific behaviors. That expectation is the thing, and that is empowering. It is uncomfortable because it puts the emphasis back on you, but it's empowering because it allows you to start to think of ways to interact with your children that doesn't have this expectation built into it. And I'll say this as well. Expectations are the problem in most relationships. And if you can have a relationship with a child, with a coworker, with a parent, with a spouse, with a friend, with a sibling, where you remove expectations, that relationship will automatically improve and be better just from that practice, just the attempt at not having expectations. And I know that that seems somewhat impossible to most people, but I'm here to tell you it can be done. It is so worth it. The reward of operating from a place of openness and allowing the other person to choose their own behavior and not having expectations, you're just saving yourself resentment, disappointment, and all sorts of letdown by starting to practice this concept of not having expectations.
Yeah. So, one thing I want to hear you talk about, because you are a parent to 6 children, and you were telling me before we started this podcast that you chose to not yell when you were pregnant with your first child. Like, what? So was that giving you 9 months to kind of like, how do I want to operate out of a different space? Like, what's kind of like your journey in parenting where you didn't start yelling, but you also had to parent that were sometimes kind of hard to deal with?
Right. What I noticed was that I shifted straight from not yelling to physical force. So yeah, I didn't yell because I had made that commitment. And I would grit my teeth a lot because I was clamping my mouth shut, and I would be physical. Grab them by the arm, maybe squeeze their arm a little bit tighter than I needed to. Those sorts of things where I was non-verbally communicating. So you could say yelling with your hands instead of yelling with your mouth. And when I realized that this was the same thing, that the principle behind it is trying to control that child, any method whatsoever, is the same thing. Whether you're someone who yells, whether you're someone who uses any kind of physical force, I think shame, guilting the child, is exactly the same as yelling or physically forcing them with your hands in terms of trying to coerce the right behavior. So I had to eat a big old slice of humble pie when I realized I was doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, because you're like, oh, look at me. I'm never going to yell at my kids. I feel so great. But then you're like, oh, crap. I am doing the exact same thing.
Yes.
Using a different method.
Yep. And it wasn't until I understood what I needed to do to replace the bad behavior, which was control, that I was able to successfully begin to parent in a way that felt empowering to me and empowering to the child. And what I did was because touching and being physical was the method of control. I wasn't a shamer. I wasn't a yeller. Those were not my particular weaknesses, which is why I think I could arrogantly make that claim. I'm not going to do that because it wasn't a temptation.
It was not a default thing for you.
No, the temptation was to be physical. So my replacement behavior had to also be physical.
Okay, that's interesting. That like you're following your tendency. You're not shunning that tendency. You're saying, what can I find in the same avenue of yelling or being physical or guilting and shaming that can be reversed into something positive?
Yep.
But staying in the same vein. Like, I love that.
Yep. So that's exactly what I did. And the answer was, I will only touch my children with love. So that means if I went to grab them roughly by the arm and sort of pull them into the vehicle or out of the grocery store, whatever the situation was, then I would ask myself before I touched them, is this a loving touch? And if the answer was no, then I would have to stop, take a breath, and say, what would be a loving touch? What can I do instead that would be a loving gesture, a loving physical touch toward this child? And it would just hold me accountable because it was about my motive. Because sometimes grabbing the child by the arm as they're about to dart out in front of traffic is a loving gesture.
Right. Sometimes that forceful and even yelling can be there's a loving way to do it inside the context.
It's your motive.
Yeah.
And when I understood that, I was able to apply that to every single situation. And before I would touch that child to try to coerce them, I would just take 1 second and say, is this love? Is this physical touch love? And if it wasn't, then I would reconsider my approach. And sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I failed to successfully meet my own desires.
Right.
And I did use physical force, but it helped me monitor how far I was willing to go. So
It was constantly keeping you in touch with your motive.
yes, sometimes I didn't know what else to do, or I was in the middle of the parking lot and I had a screaming toddler on the pavement rolling around and, making a huge scene. And, I got a baby in one arm and yeah, I'm going to grab that kid and I'm feeling a little bit angry and I'm going to drag him to the vehicle. So it's not like I never did it. It's just that the whole time I'm doing it, I'm thinking, oh, this is really an inferior method. And I think I've allowed the situation to get this bad, and now I feel like I have no choice. So learning how to preemptively protect yourself from getting to that place where you're at. What did they say?
100% rage.
Yeah, something like that. I think it's getting to the problem before you reach those levels. Because if you're there, you're probably going to yell.
Right. You're at the screaming toddler on the ground, freaking out, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. I just got to shove this kid in the car.
Right.
Like, those are not the situations in which, when you're first starting out with this new method, to
practice.
Yeah, to practice. Like, do not put yourselves in those.
And that's why I say go back to a time in the day, start paying attention to it in the day before you're angry, before you have the expectations, before the chores are supposed to be done, and lock into that feeling. This is how I want to feel towards my kids all the time. And what do I need to do to maintain this emotional connection and this warm, loving feeling that I have toward them? I don't want to compromise that. And having expectations will 100% compromise that feeling. The minute you expect them to be any other way than they are, in that moment, even if you disapprove of it, you are going to feel anger because you have just breached your own boundary. Sometimes when I had a child that was throwing a tantrum or behaving in a way that was just abominable, I would ask myself, why do you want this child to behave any different than they are right now? And sometimes it would be because I'm embarrassed, because, my mother is over and this child is misbehaving and she might be judging me. Other times it might just be I'm exhausted and their screaming is hurting my ears. I mean, there's a number of responses we can have for it, but you'll notice that it's almost always about you.
Right, like, I'm embarrassed. My ears hurt. I'm at my wit's end. I'm over this.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're not managing you. You're trying to manage the child to meet your need. And that's really unfair. And the listener even said that this is unfair to my kids. And she's 100% right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's unfair to her. 100% right. So understanding that and then being able to say, oh, it's the expectations. That's where I'm crossing the line. What is my replacement behavior? If I'm not going to yell, what can I do instead? Maybe it's I'm only going to speak with love. So is this are these words loving? Is my motive for saying this coming from a place of love or a desire to control?
Which is where tapping into that memory or that connection to feeling that love and appreciation and like overwhelming joy being around your children is going to help you like find that center of like if this is actually coming from a place of love.
Right.
Like that's why you need those to fall back on instead of falling back on the expectation not being met, because that will just produce frustration, rage, and more desire to coerce.
And you want to catch it early. You want to notice that you're having an expectation really, really early before you get to the rage point.
Yeah.
And start managing it at that level. Once you get a little bit of control over yourself rather than control over your children and what you want them to do, then we can shift over to the second part of the question. And this has to do with motivating your kids. Now, these aren't entirely separate. We've covered a bit of it. Now we want to think about how can I inspire and get this child to do these behaviors because they want to. You can't get them to want to do it if you don't know how to get your wants and needs met.
Which was the first part, getting your wants and needs met.
Yeah.
And then looking at how do I motivate my children?
Right.
Now that I feel good about where I'm
Right. Managing your behavior is going to help you teach them how to manage theirs. Showing them respect is going to teach them how to have respect for you. But you're not in a position to teach that and to help them discover it if you're still struggling with it and trying to figure it out for yourself. So then you can go to the child and begin to explore, what do I need to do to help this child want to do this behavior? And you don't know the answer. Only the child knows the answer. That's why rewards and that, they don't really work, because that might not be what the child needs to want to do it. And I think it's why people opt for punishment, because fear very consistently gets results.
Well, it's pretty universal regardless of personality, and you're just likely to get pretty consistent results regardless of personality differences.
Yeah.
Where I think motivation, like you have to take into account the different personalities of each one of your kids if you have multiple children.
Yes. And so it's a long process. It's the whole life of yourself as a parent. You're going to be practicing this. You're going to be asking your children the same questions you asked yourself. What do you want? Maybe your child says, I want to play with my toys and I don't want to do this job. And you could say, what would make you want to do this job? What would make you want to respond to me when I talk to you? And begin to understand what they want and need. But you can't do that until you take care of your wants and needs. And you recognize that you're having expectations of little children, hoping that they're going to meet your needs for you. But once you realize they can't, only I can meet my wants and needs, then you're in a position to begin to inspire and influence your children to be able to do the things that need to be done, like taking care of chores and being respectful and having a good attitude. All of that is just going to get more complicated the older they get if you aren't able to resolve this issue right now.
Yeah. And I think, kids are watching their parents. Like from a young age, I'm shocked at the age that kids start looking at their parents for how to be. And I think when an empowered parent is parenting, They are empowering their children to find their own power.
So true. So true. And I just want to acknowledge that it is so hard being a parent. It is so tough. And I've been in the trenches. I know exactly how hard it is. I know exactly how at the end of your rope you can feel and how uncertain you are about the choices you're making because you don't get to see the results of your actions for 10 or 20 years sometimes. You're making decisions that are going to have permanent consequences in the life of another human being, and you don't even get the test results back until they're adults.
Right, until they come back to you and be like, oh, I love that you did this, or, oh, that was really rough, you know?
Yeah, you ruined my life.
Right?
And you don't know.
Yeah.
It is such a scary, uncertain experience. Right? So I just have to acknowledge that this is a really tough job you're doing, and it can really take it out of you. But hopefully some of this can help, and just keep going and don't give up on yourself because you are the example. Like you were saying earlier, if you can figure out how to be peaceful and loving and respectful, your kids are going to learn how to do it too. And you're going to be able to guide them on their journey toward those same results.
Yeah. Well, I hope that this episode encourages anyone who is struggling with something and they feel at a loss for where to start, where to go. Because I think what the two topics that we did cover in these two listener stories, I think a lot of people relate to on a lot of different levels. But anyone who is interested in sending something in, for sure, like we love to hear listener stories. Well, thanks for chatting with me today. It's been very enjoyable. Love walking through people's personal stories and struggles. It's been a good time. We'll do it again for sure.
Absolutely.